Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Let us pray. Great Redeemer, guide our lawmakers along the best path to fulfill your purposes on earth. May they submit to your wisdom and providential leading, believing that you will supply all of their needs. Remind them that your unfailing love accompanies those who put their trust in you. Lord, give our senators an attitude of reverential awe that will keep them from evil. Inspire them to rejoice and be glad as they strive to live lives of purity and obedience. And Lord, as we remember Pearl Harbor on this December 7th, thank you for your loving and prevailing providence. May we show our gratitude by facing the future without fear. We pray in your majestic name. Amen.
Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
1 minute for morning business.
Without objection.
I want to visit with my colleagues about something that hasn't happened in Iowa for over 100 years. Over the weekend, the Iowa State football team completed their regular season play. The Cyclones are having a noteworthy season. They secured the first place rank in the Big 12 Conference regular season after winning 5 consecutive conference games and 8 overall conference wins this season. The good news doesn't stop there for the Iowa State football program. The Cyclones finished first place in the league play for the first time since 1912, when they won the Missouri Valley Conference. This has earned the Cyclones their well-deserved spot in the Big 12 title game on December the 19th, the first ever Big 12 championship appearance in Iowa State University's history. I want to applaud the Cyclones for their historic season. So many fans, including me, will be rooting them on for the Big 12 championship game. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Stephen Sidney Schwartz of Virginia, to be a judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I'm speaking both as a senator from Vermont and as vice chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And I'm speaking with concern about what's happening in the Senate. It's been 321 days since the first COVID-19 case was reported in the United States. 321 days. It's been 282 days since the first COVID-19 death was reported in the United States. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the unemployment rate in November was 6.7%, nearly double the rate in November of last year. Hundreds of thousands of small businesses across the country have closed permanently, all due to COVID. As of today, there are more than 14,800,000 reported cases of COVID-19 in the United States. To put that in perspective, that's 1 million more than just a week ago. More than 282,000 Americans have died. And it's been 256 days since the Senate passed the CARES Act. 256 days since the Senate acted in a comprehensive, meaningful way to address the real and mounting concerns and needs of our constituents. My state of Vermont is like everywhere else. Healthcare workers, caregivers, business owners, employees, teachers, and students, all in need of support in these difficult and uncertain times. We have families wrestling with heightened food insecurity. People who, for the first time in their lives, they can't feed their children, they can't feed themselves. They have the threat of eviction hanging over them. We have states that are strapped by budget shortfalls. They're forced to lay off thousands of employees, people who work so hard for the people of their state. It's been 205 days since the House first passed the HEROES Act. And it's been 65 days since they stepped forward to offer a substantial compromise on the HEROES Act and pass it again. And where does it sit? It sits on my friend the Republican leader's desk. It's collecting dust. It's the largest and most significant bill in the McConnell legislative graveyard. Why aren't we voting? Look what happens. We can't bring ourselves to actually vote on something to help Americans, help the people of our own state. They're being thrown out of their houses, their apartments, and out of their jobs. And we come in for a few days, then get on an airplane, fly back home, taxpayers paying for it, taxpayers paying our salaries and all, and nothing happens. Now, like millions of Americans, I'm encouraged by the news in recent weeks that pharmaceutical companies are making significant progress in vaccine development. I'm encouraged that some of these vaccines may be available as early as later this month. But let's not forget why we're able to develop vaccines so quickly. It's because of long-standing federal investment in cutting-edge research at the National Institutes of Health. Research has been backed by so many of us in both parties for years in this body. NIH-funded research in genetic and genomic sequencing enabled the rapid and efficient pivot to COVID-19 research that led to the vaccine. This is the power of federal dollars when it's targeted to solve a national problem. We need more of that today. The development of several promised vaccines is great news. But if you don't have a comprehensive plan in place and the resources to implement it, how can we ensure that vaccination is safe, effective, widely available, and free? Can anybody stand up and say every part of their state will have vaccination? No, the money's not there yet. We have nothing on that. And it's complete abdication of our responsibility as elected representatives that we simply failed to act. Now, I know that my friends across the aisle will probably rush to the floor. They'll blame Democrats for stalling their inadequate, face-saving proposal that they went through the motion to bring before the elections. Remember what it was. It was a giveaway to insurance companies and didn't even have the courage to allow amendments where people would actually have to vote up or down. It was easier to make a face-saving gesture knowing it would go anywhere. Sure, it made some investment in small businesses. It provided some employment relief, albeit at a significantly reduced level. But it also tied educational relief to forcing kids back into the classroom, even if it's in an area where it wasn't safe to accommodate those children. It failed to deliver on relief to state and local governments, which are continuing to try to provide essential services to their communities, as our government is in Vermont. It included nothing for low-income home energy assistance, LIHEAP, and it was snowing, and I know our state and a lot of other northern states this week. It had no funding for mental health service. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what's going on? No funding for mental health service. There's no funding for nutrition assistance. There wasn't a dime for NIH research. And it didn't have a plan, a vigorous plan or investment in vaccination production and distribution. It's one thing to say, we have these super cold things on an airplane. Wonderful. When are you going to be able to bring it to our factories, our schools, our hospitals, our senior citizens, and actually vaccinate them? So, what was the legislation brought up here? It created a shield for corporate misconduct. And what it said that my friends, the Republicans, are more keen to shield corporate cronies than to work on behalf of the American people. That's a sham. It's a shame. Especially when we find at least one of those corporations they want to shield, they were betting on who would get COVID first. The managers were. Now, in my home state of Vermont, our governor, our state legislature, our mayors, our town leaders across the state have taken bold moves to slow the spread of COVID. Our governor is a Republican, I'm a Democrat. I praise him for what he did. I talked with him again today for the steps he's taken, difficult steps, hard steps, but steps to keep Vermonters safe. And these moves, taken in my state of Vermont, they've resulted in lower instances of the virus than anywhere else in the country. But, as the governor said, and I've said, and everybody else said, they've come with a cost. We've kept people safe, but not without a cost. Unemployment remains. Small businesses continue to struggle if they're even able to stay in existence. And that says nothing of the personal hardship families are facing across our small state. One elderly woman called my office. She expressed frustration with the president. She told my staff that she's only been able to visit her husband, who was in a medical rehab facility, a couple of times during this pandemic due to COVID restrictions. Now, that's not an anecdote. That's a personal tragedy. In Vermont, the state and local governments are worrying about how to clear the roads this winter if COVID hits the plow crews. Snow removal isn't a luxury in Vermont in the winter, it's a necessity. You know, we sometimes have 7, 8, 9, 10 inches of snow overnight, but we expect our businesses and our schools to open that day. I don't know how many times at home on a snowy night, I'm awakened at 4:30 in the morning as I hear the snow plows going by on the road, and I know I can get to my office a couple hours later. And we've had nearly a foot of snow. My staff spoke with one Vermont mother, not unusual. She's raising a son with autism. With school systems strained to their limit, special education services have been sharply reduced. That's going to have a lasting impact on these students, both educationally and socially. And for those who are facing challenges like addiction, depression, or mental health issues, and that could be any one of our states, or simply down their luck before COVID hit earlier this year, access to vital resources, counseling, intervention, has been made more complicated by COVID restrictions, often with tragic results. I heard of one Vermonter who passed away alone in a motel room in Rutland in October. Battling mental health issues, he had become homeless just as COVID struck earlier this year. And due to the risks of the virus, family and friends were unable to take him into their homes. This isn't just a story, it's a man's life. And there are so many more people out there facing the same struggles. We're seeing images of car lines and food banks stretching for miles. Unprecedented wave of food insecurity washing over our country. In our state, my state alone, 1 in every 4 Vermonters now food insecure. Before this pandemic is already an unacceptable 1 in 10. We're asking children to learn without providing the necessary resources, their teachers, their families to pay rent without their jobs, and people to deal with their chronic illnesses while our hospitals are still stretched to capacity. All this while an unacceptable amount of people are unsure how they'll put food on the table to the end of the week in the wealthiest nation on earth. That's unconscionable. And I must say that the leadership across the aisle, they've got to bring up these bills. Stop stalling. You know, they say we only need a targeted approach, and they point to the stock market as proof. These people out of their jobs aren't looking at the stock market. These people who can't feed their children aren't looking at the stock market. These people whose rent has come due and they can't pay it, to them that's nonsense. The economy is not going to recover until we vanquish the virus. It's that simple, it's that basic, and people are suffering now. That's the cost of inaction. Inaction on real, comprehensive, bold COVID relief legislation. And so now, with our backs against the wall, with a funding deadline looming, we're racing to accomplish what should have been done months ago. Annual appropriations bills to keep our government running. We were ready on this side of the aisle to vote on those back in June. Have a couple of amendments up or down. Republicans in the majority, if they didn't like a Democratic amendment, they could vote it down. We could have done it back then. Now, deadline's this week, months later. We have to pass these bills before Congress adjourns this year, so there's no disruption in our government services during this difficult time in our country. That only exacerbate the growing problems facing many Americans today. But our annual appropriations bills are no substitute for the significant investment we need to confront this national and international emergency. We need a comprehensive COVID relief bill. It's time to get serious. Instead of flying off every weekend back home, stay here, vote these things up or down. Bring up amendments on both sides of the aisle, time agreement on the amendments, and vote them up or down, because time is wasting. And how many hours have we spent racing to confirm nomination after nomination at the expense of everything else, including dealing with the emergency of this pandemic, while COVID cases soar and more people succumb to this virus? How much more time will the Senate waste while American families and communities suffer? It's time for us to do our job. We're elected for 6-year terms. Let's stay here for 6 days during the week if need be. Let's get it done. The American people are suffering enough. We shouldn't be adding to that strain by playing politics with these essential priorities. Madam President, I'm hearing from Vermonters every day, worried about unemployment benefits, their children's education, their health, or that of their loved ones, about food security, about keeping their homes and paying their bills. The Senate, when it's been at its best, has been the conscience of the nation. It's long past time that we start acting like the conscience of the nation. 256 days since the Senate took meaningful action on this COVID epidemic. We shouldn't wait a day longer. Let's set everything else aside. Let's have votes on these programs. Let's vote up or down. This senator is ready to do that. And I see the distinguished leader on the floor, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Missouri.
Madam President, in recognition of his outstanding service to my office this last year, I ask unanimous consent that Captain Ryan Albin, the defense fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
we've reached a time of year when the Senate has more important outstanding business than we have days to complete it. Delivering for the American people will take focus, dexterity, and genuine bipartisanship. On government funding, as I've said for weeks, it's my hope that our committee's work will bear fruit and a full-year funding package will come to the floor in both chambers. I anticipate that the Senate will take up a one-week extension this week so the government does not close on December the 11th and work can continue through the end of next week. The nation needs our Democratic colleagues to resist the temptation to play brinksmanship with long-settled policy issues or push poison pill riders that they know would tank the process. We also expect to receive and pass a conference report on the annual defense authorization, and we need to continue confirming impressive nominees to vacancies in the judiciary and the executive branch. We senators are no strangers to end-of-year drama. By this time, the stakes are far higher. We're up against another, even steeper surge in COVID-19 than we saw back in the spring. Workers and small businesses are once again struggling to make ends meet as states and localities step up precautions. And while the latest news on vaccine trials suggests that victory over the virus may soon be within reach, our work in that area is far from complete. As one recent article put it, state and local officials plead for vaccine distribution funds. Our nation's historic sprint to victory through vaccines seems poised to succeed in record time, but the critical last step, getting hundreds of millions of doses out to American people, is still in front of us. So Congress cannot stay on the sidelines. Now, yesterday, our colleague from Illinois, the Democratic whip, gave an interview in which he named 3 examples of highly urgent matters that need to be addressed for our nation right now. This is the Democratic whip of the U.S. Senate. Here are the 3 things Senator Durbin mentioned as flashing red urgent priorities. The millions of people who are going to lose their unemployment insurance the day after Christmas, the businesses that are trying to decide whether or not they can continue, and the vaccine logistics to make sure that this vaccine is on the road and vaccinating people across America as quickly as possible. Those are the 3 things he mentioned. Those are the 3 urgent issues he named as examples. extending unemployment insurance, helping small businesses, and funding vaccine distribution. Well, Madam President, I do not question the sincerity of our colleague, who I believe is engaged in these discussions in good faith, but these comments illustrate perfectly a point that Republicans have been making for weeks. For weeks. These three urgent issues are issues where there is almost total bipartisan consensus. No real disagreement whatsoever. In fact, the framework for a small targeted relief package that I put forward last week, something which Democrats quickly attacked, would have resolved all three of those subjects. All three of them. The targeted Republican framework extends unemployment insurance programs that will otherwise expire. It creates an entire second round of the Paycheck Protection Program for the hardest hit small businesses, and it lays the groundwork to distribute the vaccines that appear to be on the horizon. Check, check, check. The Democratic whip is right to recognize these three subjects are especially urgent because they are especially urgent. That's why Republicans have been trying over and over to get them passed. That's why Republicans have been saying for months that Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leaders should let Congress get outcomes in all the places where we already agree, rather than holding everything hostage over their most controversial partisan demands. But month after month after month, it is the Democratic leaders who have said that no relief whatsoever can pass, no consensus items can become law, unless multiple controversial areas where we don't agree are resolved to the Democrats' liking. That's why the Democratic leader had every single Senate Democrat vote to filibuster a targeted COVID-19 release package back in September and again in October. That bill would have taken care of small businesses, unemployment insurance, and vaccine distribution months ago. Months ago. Senate Democrats blocked it. Well, I think if the Senate Democratic leader would allow it, the three things that the Democratic whip mentioned just yesterday, small business aid, re-upping unemployment aid, and setting up vaccine distribution, would pass the Senate in a landslide. In a landslide. A targeted compromise on the most urgent items would pass by a massive bipartisan margin. We could easily put together a whole slew of common sense policies, including those three and other things like legal protections that universities and the American Council on Education have been pleading for. Bring it to the floor and pass it. Everyone knows why this hasn't happened. There's one reason. The Speaker of the House and the Democratic leader have spent months tying the most bipartisan common sense policies to their most controversial requests, and saying the country can't get the former unless it gets the latter. Their strategy has been all or nothing. And so struggling Americans have, of course, got nothing. Well, we're down to the wire, Madam President, down to the wire. The light at the end of the tunnel is in sight. Operation Warp Speed seems poised to deliver vaccines on an historic, almost miraculous timetable. We have seen some hopeful signs of engagement from our Democratic colleagues, but we have no reason to think the underlying disagreements about policy are going to evaporate overnight. Republicans and Democrats do not need to resolve every one of our differences to get badly needed relief out the door. We just need both sides to finally do what members of Congress do when they're serious about wanting an outcome. Drop the all or nothing tactics, drop the hostage taking, and make law. in the many places where we have common ground. That's what the country is counting on. That's how we can do right by the American people before Christmas. So let's get it done. Madam President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 912.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Election Commission, Alan Dickerson of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Alan Dickerson of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 913.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Election Commission, Shauna M. Broussard of Louisiana to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Shauna M. Broussard of Louisiana to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I send the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 914.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. And the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Election Commission, Sean J. Cooksey of Missouri to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Sean J. Cooksey of Missouri to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate resume consideration of the Swartz nomination.
Without objection.
Okay. I suggest the advocacy forum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
Democratic
Are we in
leader.
a quorum?
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, last night we received the sad news that a former colleague of ours, one of our finest, Paul Sarbanes, has passed away. While our time in the Senate only overlapped for one term, Senator Sarbanes made a deep impression. Known as the stealth senator, he was low-key but extremely effective, a leader on a wide-ranging group of issues from environmental stewardship to consumer privacy to anything having to do with his home state of Maryland. He was very soft-spoken, but he had determination like iron and worked and worked and worked on issue after issue till he achieved his goals. We mourn the passing of this beloved former colleague and this consummate senator. Now on COVID. Everyone knows we're entering the worst stretch of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the winter months force more Americans indoors, infections are up, hospitalizations are up, and the number of Americans dying from COVID is steadily and tragically increasing. The economic fallout from the latest wave of the virus will also be a huge challenge. According to one study, nearly 12 million renters will owe an average of nearly $6,000 in back rents and utilities in January. Even the conservative U.S. Chamber of Commerce is sounding the alarm about a double-dip recession if Congress does not pass another round of emergency federal relief before the end of the year. Unfortunately, our efforts to pass another emergency relief bill through the Senate have been stalled until now for one reason. The Republican leader has refused to compromise. Again today, we heard the same old song from the Republican leader. His position has not budged since March. First, he put the Senate on pause while the spread of the virus got worse and worse. Then, after pressure mounted, the Republican leader finally decided to put forward a series of bills that compromised only the things that the Republicans want. While the nation has been clamoring for a bipartisan solution, the Senate, under the leadership of the Republican leader, has only been allowed to vote on partisan Republican proposals, each of which has been sorely inadequate, and each of which has contained poison pills designed to ensure the bill's failure. The Republican leader never mentions those poison pills in his speeches to this chamber, where he excoriates Democrats for refusing to pass, quote, bipartisan legislation that everyone agrees on. But bipartisan does not mean Democrats must agree to whatever the Republican leader wants or whatever issues he picks. Bipartisan means both sides sitting down, finding an agreement. We all know that's the case. We have a Democratic House. They're going to need Democratic votes in the Senate. So Senate Democrats are simply asking the Republican leader to do one thing: sit down and negotiate. Now, since March, since Secretary Mnuchin and I negotiated the CARES bill, the Republican leader has constantly refused to sit down with Republicans and negotiate a bipartisan solution. He puts his bill with no Democratic input on the floor and says, take it or leave it. That is no way to get things done. It wasn't in April or May or June or July or August or September or November, and it isn't now. Speaker, we want the leader to sit down and negotiate so we can come up with a bipartisan proposal that can pass both the House and the Senate. And Speaker Pelosi and I have modified our proposal several times in an effort to meet our Republican counterparts in the middle. Last week, Speaker Pelosi and I went even further and agreed to use a bipartisan bill crafted by moderate senators from both sides of the aisle as a framework for the negotiations. We have not heard the same willingness from the Republican leader. However, there are some encouraging signs. The bipartisan group of senators and House members working on this latest proposal continues to make progress. I was encouraged to see the senator from Louisiana this weekend say he was hopeful the president would sign such an agreement. Let's use the work of the Gang of Eight as the basis for bipartisan negotiations and compromise. The bottom line, we have to get something done for the American people before the end of the year. We Democrats have been trying since the spring, back when Republicans were saying, quote, they did not feel the urgency of acting. I believe those were the leader's words. Well, it's going to take a sense of urgency now, Mr. Leader, and it's going to take a willingness to give a little, not just to put your bill on the floor and say, take it or leave it. As I said, it's encouraging that some Republicans are already on that path. Hopefully, the Republican leader can catch up with the more fair-minded members of his caucus. Now on nominations, another matter. The incoming Biden administration continues to name candidates it will tap to lead cabinet agencies and other key positions in the federal government. Today, President-elect Biden introduced his health care team, including Dr. Fauci, who will stay on, thank God, as chief medical advisor, Dr. Vivek Murthy to serve as Surgeon General, Dr. Rochelle Walensky to head the CDC, and Javier Becerra, the Attorney General of California, to be the next Secretary of Health and Human Services. Like most of President Biden's selections so far, Mr. Becerra's nomination is groundbreaking. He would be the first Latino to ever run the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, these nominees, once confirmed, will face a monumental task. President-elect Biden will inherit a once-in-a-generation health care crisis, a crisis made worse by the Trump administration's lack of focus, competency, and consistency over the past year. By naming a deeply experienced and tested team of senior health care advisors, President-elect Biden is getting ready to right the ship and execute a whole-of-government approach to crushing the virus and providing affordable health care to all Americans. As safe and effective vaccines become available over the next year, President-elect Biden's team will also have to work with states and health care providers to get Americans vaccinated. To state the obvious, health care is going to be the #1 challenge when the new administration takes office. We're in the middle of a once-in-a-century public health crisis. Accordingly, President-elect Biden's team should be confirmed swiftly to ensure that no time is lost in the fight against the pandemic. Regrettably, there's a split screen this week between the seriousness of the incoming Biden administration and the activities of the Republican majority here in the Senate. On Tuesday, the Republican chairman of the Homeland Security Committee has invited Dr. Jane Orient to give testimony at a hearing in his committee. Dr. Orient is a member of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, a benign-sounding name that obscures some dangerous policies. According to the New York Times, Dr. Orient's association, quote, opposes government involvement in medicine and views federal vaccine mandates as a violation of human rights, unquote. Dr. Orient herself has expressed skepticism about coronavirus vaccines and continues to hawk hydroxychloroquine as COVID-19 treatment, following the lead of President Trump, who boosted the drug despite scientific evidence that it's ineffective. So while President Biden is nominating experienced, committed public servants to lead the administration's health care policy, the next administration's health care policy, the Republican majority is inviting prominent anti-vaxxers to Senate committee hearings. A study in contrasts, to say the least. After one of the most difficult years in recent memory, we finally have a light at the end of the tunnel in the discovery of several effective and safe vaccines. They're the best chance we have of ending the terrible scourge of this disease and getting our lives back to normal. And yet, the effectiveness of the vaccine only matters insofar as the number of Americans who are willing to take it. The more Senate Republicans dip their toes into the water of these anti-science, anti-vax conspiracy theories, the more damage it does to our country. Public figures at all levels should be building up confidence in a vaccine, not giving a platform to those who would undermine it. The senator from Wisconsin, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, should revoke his invitation to Dr. Orient. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I came to the floor to talk about some other things, but I just want to say in response to our friend, the Democratic leader, it sounds to me that he's got a case of do as I say, not as I do when it comes to COVID-19 relief bills. If my memory serves me correctly, he has led the effort to block the Senate's consideration of 5 different COVID-19 relief bills. Speaker Pelosi has made the incredible statement that nothing is better than something when it comes to COVID-19 relief. That's easy to say when you're still getting a paycheck, when you've got a job you can go do and you can provide for your family and you have access to health care. But for the millions of Americans who suffered through this pandemic, those are words that sound a lot like Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake. I mention this because I've been around this place long enough to know that unless you tell people the whole story, too often they believe the talking points and the half story, the incomplete story, like we heard from the Democratic leader. It is shameful that after passing 4 separate COVID-19 relief bills, including the CARES Act through the end of March, on virtually unanimous basis, that Speaker Pelosi chose to pass a partisan bill out of the House, the HEROES bill, for another $3 trillion, including things like tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires in New York and San Francisco, unrelated to the COVID-19 relief bill that we needed. So I applaud the group of bipartisan senators who've been working now after the election to try to come up with the relief, rather than kicking this can down the road and leaving people in the lurch during the Christmas holiday season. And then when it comes to the vaccine, I have no doubt that the incoming administration is going to claim complete credit for producing a vaccine and getting this virus in the rearview mirror. I understand why they would be tempted to do so, but it is because of the bipartisan action that Congress has taken with this administration through Operation Warp Speed that we've seen our world-class scientists come up with safe and effective, I hope, soon-to-be certified vaccines by the Food and Drug Administration, and people can begin to start getting vaccinated by the middle of this month. That is a modern-day miracle. We should all be proud of it, but it should not be part of a partisan campaign now after we've had an election on November the 3rd. I wish our friends would get out of the campaign mode and get into the governing mode. We've got important work we need to do here. And part of that, Madam President, is the Jenna Quinn law. This bipartisan piece of legislation that I introduced with Senator Hassan over a year and a half ago to help identify and stop child sexual abuse in communities across our country has passed the Senate unanimously, but stuck in the House of Representatives. Nationwide, there are more than 42,000 survivors of child sexual abuse, adults now. 42 million adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Sadly, these victims often stay silent for days, months, years, even a lifetime. As a result, they and countless other victims continue to be abused. We need to stop this cycle as quickly as possible, and that's why the Jenna Quinn law is so important. It's modeled after a 2009 Texas law, which requires teachers and caregivers and other adults who work with children receive training on how to identify and report child sexual abuse. After the Texas law passed in 2009, one study found educators reported child sexual abuse at a rate almost 4 times greater after the training than they got during their pre-training career. Jenna Quinn herself tells the story of her own mother saying, "If I'd just known you were showing all the classic symptoms of a victim of child sexual abuse, I would have intervened sooner." Well, the 2009 Texas law was one of the first to mandate this training, and now more than half of all the states have adopted a form of Jenna's law. So you may ask, why do we need to pass a federal law? Well, the states don't have the funding for the training, and that's what the Jenna Quinn law provides. It allows the current Department of Health and Human Services grant funds to be used for this specialized training. This bill has received the support of every member of the Senate Help Committee, Republicans and Democrats, not surprisingly, and it's passed the Senate unanimously. But it's been months and we're still waiting for the House of Representatives to act. Just last week, House Democrats under Speaker Pelosi did find time to act on a bill to decriminalize marijuana, on a bill to deal with large cats, the Tiger King bill. But did they have time to provide assistance to small businesses? Did they find time to pass bipartisan COVID-19 relief? Did they find time to pass the Jenna Quinn law, which I'm sure if put on their suspension calendar would pass very quickly and go to the president for his signature? In a move that defies common sense, the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee in the House, Congressman Bobby Scott, is blocking the Jenna Quinn law. He voted to decriminalize marijuana. He voted to ban the private ownership of big cats, but he won't even let the Jenna Quinn law receive an up or down vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. Well, if you're confused by the logic of this move, you're not alone, especially because the urgency for this legislation has only grown during the pandemic. As families have stayed at home as part of the mitigation efforts, their lives have been filled with a range of new stressors: loss of income, isolation, health anxiety, and the stress of teaching children at home can test even the healthiest families and relationships. But they also put children at a higher risk for abuse and neglect. In April of this year, nationwide reports of abuse or neglect dropped an average of 40% compared to the same time last year. Now, ordinarily you would say, well, that's good news, but the reason why the reports of abuse and neglect have dropped is because children have not been going to their classrooms, where the teachers who train in identifying these signs and symptoms can see them and help them by intervening. In 2018, 2/3 of the reports of child abuse were submitted by people who came in contact with children as part of their jobs. I mentioned teachers, counselors, caregivers, but also police officers, lawyers, social services, but predominantly teachers who see these children at school. Teachers, education professionals, and other support staff at schools, like bus drivers, are responsible for more than half of the reports of child abuse. But as I said, with children home during the pandemic, out of sight from their teachers and other adults they would otherwise see on a routine basis, abuse is becoming more difficult to identify and report. Not because it's not happening, but because these children are having to suffer silently, living with, perhaps locked down with, their abuser. As the stresses of the pandemic and the lack of reporting take a violent toll on our children across the country, it is time for action. Not excuses, not decriminalizing marijuana, not a Tiger King bill, but passing legislation that will actually make their lives better, give them some hope. Not action at some time in the future, but now. And there's one person in the House of Representatives that's holding that up right now, and that's Chairman Scott. Children are suffering every day, Madam President. They're not worried about politics or whether Chairman Scott has the leverage he needs to advance a larger partisan bill later on next year. These victims are worried about their own safety. They're worried about how much longer will it be till some adult identifies my abuse and gets me out of this abusive relationship, gets me out of a living nightmare. Well, the sort of mindless obstruction we're seeing from Chairman Scott in the House exemplifies everything people loathe about Congress. Holding up a bill to prevent child sexual abuse as a means to gain political leverage for a bigger partisan bill. It's just shameful. Let's call it what it is, shameful. It's time for Chairman Scott to stop blocking the Jenna Quinn law so we can provide the life-saving training to the men and women most likely to stop the cycle of child sexual abuse. And finally, Madam President, last week here on the Senate floor, I spoke briefly about our retiring colleague, Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming, and some wisdom he imparted to me shortly after I arrived in the Senate. Something he calls the 80-20 rule. As our friend from Wyoming told me, you're never going to agree or disagree with somebody 100% of the time, but that doesn't mean you can't get important work done. So instead of just focusing on the 20% you can't agree on, look at the 80% you can agree on. I hope all of our colleagues will remember this formula for success in the coming days as we work to deliver another round of coronavirus relief for the American people. It's clear we're never going to agree 100% of the time on what that bill should look like, but I bet we can agree on 80%, and we ought to get that 80% done. We all believe that additional funding for our schools is necessary to keep our students and teachers healthy and kids on track for a good education, that American workers who had the rug pulled out from under them earlier this year deserve additional support, that a second round of job-saving Paycheck Protection Program funds would help even more workers and small businesses, and that another investment in vaccine distribution is essential to bringing this pandemic to an end. Last week, Leader McConnell announced progress in the negotiations to pass another bill by the end of the year. He's spoken with the President's team and the Speaker, and there are hopeful signs. There appears to be a path forward on this legislation that could clear both chambers and receive the signature of the President, and I hope we will follow that path to a constructive conclusion. As I said last week, the best Christmas present we could give the American people would be to work together in a bipartisan way to provide that relief. We need an outcome, and to get there, it's going to take compromise. It's going to take the 80-20 rule. This process requires input and agreement from our colleagues in the Senate, the House, and the White House, as does all legislation. But my constituents, and I dare say all Americans, are fed up with the dysfunction they see and the partisanship that is for no real purpose that has delayed this COVID-19 relief bill for months. It's time to reach an agreement and deliver yet another round of coronavirus relief for the American people.
Madam President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to highlight some meaningful progress underway on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests to improve the health of these forests. These collaborative efforts are showing progress and are an example of where we could go nationally. Collaboration brings results. I've been a long-time champion of collaboration to address public lands management disputes, as collaborative processes are good for the environment and good for natural resource-based economies. Collaborative problem solving is a key way to ensure that all voices are heard and long-term solutions are crafted. Working together through collaboration does not require a sacrifice of principles, but it does require earnest negotiations with respect for ideas from all perspectives and a willingness to work to understand each other's objectives. Inevitably, at several points along the collaborative path, there are strong disagreements. However, participants' refusal to quit is a key attribute of successful collaborative efforts. One of the greatest benefits of collaboration is that it enables the achievement of solutions that are better than the status quo for all stakeholders. Such solutions are better for the environment and the economy. Through collaboration, participants can actually achieve their objectives and in ways that benefit the entire community. The work on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest is a great example of the benefits of collaborative efforts. The Clearwater Basin Collaborative, or CBC as we call it, which was officially launched 12 years ago, has had an important role in furthering discussions about the management of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests. Nez Perce tribal representatives, representatives of federal and state agencies, county commissioners, local communities, timber companies, conservation groups, and other stakeholders make up the CBC's working group that accommodates a diverse array of viewpoints and objectives. I met with members of the predecessor group called the Conkleville Collaborative and welcomed the opportunity to be a part of the CBC's official launch in 2008. I tracked the group's progress through dedicating a member of my staff to being a part of its discussions, focused on resolving long-standing concerns and achieving land management decisions and fostering communication among different interest groups. The remarkable landscape it works to enhance encompasses forest lands providing habitat for treasured wildlife and anadromous fish species, resources for local communities, including timber, livestock, grazing, and mining, and natural carbon sinks that help our planet. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest spans 4 million acres. 3 rivers flow through the forest, providing important water resources, outstanding fishing, and other recreational opportunities. It is truly a remarkable place. And the group's work is far from easy, as there is a lot at stake. The good news is that we're hearing reports of remarkable achievements being made on the forests. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests have received 3 significant recognitions this year alone that highlight cooperative restoration work. A Regional Foresters Award for fostering partnership and volunteerism, a Chiefs Award for delivering benefits to the public, and an Undersecretary's Award for customer service for Forests Historic Routes projects. Through the Historic Routes projects, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest dedicated approximately $1 million of retained receipt from stewardship contracts to improve water quality through historically sensitive maintenance along 3 historic roadways, the Lolo Motorway, the Elk City Wagon Road, and the Magruder Road, that attract visitors from all over the country. Project leaders, recognizing the importance of these routes to the local economy and historical significance, have partnered with local groups and the University of Idaho to include digital interpretation that is accessible even in locations without internet service. The project has also been supported through the Secure Rural Schools Resource Advisory Committee to assist with the maintenance. Stewardship contracts have also been used on the Nez Perce Clearwater Forest to enable the Forest Service to accomplish vegetation and watershed restoration. By leveraging this program with other partnerships and funding sources, the forests are able to have a truly integrated restoration program. Stewardship contracts have enabled fuels and weed treatment, watershed protection and restoration, road maintenance, and enhancements such as the removal of wire fencing to help wildlife. A total of 536 miles of streams have been restored on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, resulting in the forest being ranked 4th nationwide in miles of streams restored. The forests have a strong partnership with the Nez Perce tribe, which contributes greatly to its watershed restoration accomplishments. At the same time, priorities of much-needed restoration of landscapes, including water quality improvements, are also providing a supply of raw materials to our local mills. In fact, the forests are the 5th in the nation in providing wood products for purchase. More work is underway to address significant challenges, but this is the direction we need to continue to go in delivering long-term results. I commend all those involved in this effort for their hard and exemplary work improving our treasured landscapes. Also, a Good Neighbor Authority program coordinated by the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest and the Idaho Department of Lands was recognized with the 2017 Regional Forester Awards. Through the program, forest management has supported fuels reduction and watershed restoration. Further, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest recently signed a Good Neighbor Authority agreement with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. This will enable the forest and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game to work more seamlessly as they collaborate on projects to enhance wildlife habitat, such as aspen restoration. Statewide, the Idaho Department of Lands reports the agency is utilizing Good Neighbor Authority to partner with national forests in Idaho to expedite projects focused on fuels reduction, forest health improvements, and watershed health. According to an IDL summary from January of this year, the program has enabled the treatment of 4,800 acres through 50 service contracts at a total value of over $3 million to the private sector to treat weed infestation, reduce fuels, complete road repairs, and support project planning and monitoring. Other collaborative efforts have laid strong groundwork or follow in the footsteps of collaborative work such as this. In Idaho, we have succeeded with public lands projects such as the Owyhee Initiative and are hard at work in others such as the Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative, the Payette Forest Coalition, the Boise Forest Coalition, and others, including our governor's Shared Stewardship Task Force. And I also look forward to the soon-to-be-completed recommendation of the governor's Salmon Work Group. Federal policy must empower collaboration and forest health. As senators and shared stewards of these natural resources, we must continuously work to ensure federal statute and policy empowers collaborative efforts and forest health projects. In 2003, I was proud to work with my congressional colleagues, including Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon and many others, to enact the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, or HFRA, to help provide the U.S. Forest Service with the tools needed to do the necessary work on the ground to restore our forests to health and reduce the threat of a catastrophic wildfire to our communities and ecosystems. The HFRA was designed to encourage fuel reduction efforts, protect old-growth forests, enhance water quality, promote community-based land management and public involvement in forest management, and address insect and disease problems. The HFRA has promoted stewardship contracting projects which incorporate public-private partnerships emphasizing more localized forest management. In the years since the enactment of the HFRA, Congress has enacted additional legislation to advance forest health. For example, in the 2014 Farm Bill, we included permanent authority for stewardship contracting and the authorization of Good Neighbor Authority. Good Neighbor Authority expanded the federal government's ability to partner with state foresters on restoration projects, including bark beetle treatments across state and federal boundaries. Subsequently, the 2018 Farm Bill included an expansion of Good Neighbor Authority. It credited with increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration projects across Idaho. The 2018 Farm Bill also importantly included a 10-year reauthorization of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which has enabled the expansion of active collaboration and land use groups in Idaho. The program encourages large-scale, that's 50,000 plus acres, collaborative, science-based forest restoration projects in a way that encourages environmental and economic sustainability. The U.S. Forest Service reported that in the first 10 years of the program, the CFLRP opportunities brought together more than 420 organizations to engage in local collaboratives. And CFLRP projects treated 3.8 million acres to reduce wildfire risk. The CFLRP has supported collaborative work of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative and the Nez Perce Clearwater Forests to restore conditions within the 1.4 million acre Selway Middle Fork ecosystem. Through stream improvements, the replacement of culverts, preventing fish passage, road and trail maintenance, and the reduction of wildfire fuel loads. Also, the reauthorized Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program has 2 newly approved projects in Idaho, with 1 in each region. Region 1 encompasses the Panhandle National Forest, and in Regional 4, it encompasses the Payette and Boise National Forests. And we can't let up in making progress on wildfires. The severely smoke-clogged skies this fire season made the impacts of the fires that have decimated wildlands and communities for years nearly unescapable. As we think about the lives and livelihood lost to wildfires, we must continue to work to enact bipartisan forest management reform to build on the progress made in recent years to ensure federal land agencies have the tools they need to protect communities from deadly wildfires by improving the health of our forests. Bipartisan legislation pending in this Senate would increase the active management of federal forests, cut red tape, reduce frivolous litigation, and advance fire risk reduction. Senators Steve Daines of Montana and Dianne Feinstein of California worked across party lines for months to negotiate the details of the bipartisan Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act. Enactment of sensible bipartisan legislation such as this, which is also co-sponsored by myself and my fellow senator colleague from Idaho, Jim Risch, can better enable land managers to reduce wildfire risk and respond effectively to an increasingly virulent wildfire reality. This will build on the successful enactment of bipartisan legislation to enable federal agencies to respond to wildfires as they would to other natural disasters and end the practice of fire borrowing. Forests make up 39% of the land in my home state of Idaho. They are key to air and water quality and sustain wildlife habitat and recreational opportunities. They support communities through wood and paper product jobs and recreation dollars. They are the backdrop and the means for unparalleled quality of life. Their vitality hinges on their effective management. I'm encouraged by the achievements on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests, and I urge continued collaborative efforts to address often contentious but necessary natural resource challenges and the enactment of federal law that bolsters these collaborative efforts for the betterment of all of our communities. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Over the past few months, there are many of us in this chamber that have taken big tech to task over their shady and biased business practices In more than one hearing, we've grilled them on the privacy, censorship, and antitrust concerns that have allowed us to keep these CEOs in the hot seat. And that grilling has taken place by those of us on either side of the aisle. And these are big, big problems, and they're not going to disappear at the end of this Congress. These are problems that are going to be around. But one of the advantages of having these companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google living in our phones and in our homes is that it's much harder for oppressive governments and global bad actors to hide their crimes from the rest of the world. Just last year, about this time, the freedom fighters in Hong Kong, and this is a poster that I used on the floor just about this time of year, December 9th, 2019. And it shows the freedom fighters in Hong Kong, shows how they were making their case. We do not want to become like China. These freedom fighters in Hong Kong captured our attention when they filled the streets and demanded an end to the Chinese Communist Party's terrible crackdowns on free speech and expression. And while the coverage in the 24-hour news cycle definitely made an impact, it was the millions of tweets and Facebook posts and videos and blog posts that turned their movement into a collective global outcry for an end to violence and terror in Hong Kong. You see, people saw what was happening there. They saw it in real time. And even if they didn't fully understand the politics behind these protests, they knew that the disproportionate response by the Chinese government to stamp out these protests was wrong. As those posts flowed out of Hong Kong, support flowed right back in. And having spoken with many of these brave activists, it really meant the world to them that they were hearing from us. But while all of this was happening, something else, some counter messaging, if you will, was flowing from Beijing. It was a message of total capitulation sent by corporations, sports organizations, the mainstream media, and even powerful national and world leaders. They were all trying to keep the peace on behalf of their own self-interest, but as the days and weeks passed by, their blinders became more and more obvious. By that time, the online activist community had put the Chinese Communist Party's crimes on full display. What started as a debate on free speech and political autonomy morphed into a full indictment of the Chinese Communist Party's crimes against humanity, against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and Inner Mongolia, and all across mainland China. Thanks to internet freedom efforts made possible by the Open Technology Fund, tweets and videos describing the Chinese Communist Party's intolerance of dissent escaped the Great Firewall and made its way into Western news feeds. The spread of the coronavirus tore away the veil covering Beijing's corrupt relationship with the World Health Organization and other international organizations and revealed their scandalous cover-up of the virus's origins. All that truth right on our phones, right on our iPads and computer screens, on every screen in the house. But unfortunately for the millions suffering under the horrors of communism, truth didn't win the day. The people with the most responsibilities to speak up stayed silent because they were fearful of retaliation. It was too politically charged, too economically risky. Someone might take their criticisms the wrong way. And well, we can't have that now, can we? I know from personal experience what it's like to have the Chinese Communist Party and their allies retaliate against you. Once you speak up, you're going to get it from all sides. Just last week, a member of the Chinese state media, so for all intents and purposes, I would suggest this is a propaganda minister for the Chinese Communist Party. Well, he decided that he had had enough of what we're doing here in Washington to expose Chinese aggression and fired off a series of vile, sexist tweets while conspicuously avoiding the issue at hand. Sounds fairly familiar. Attack the person, attack the messenger. But the thing is, Madam President, he was just mirroring the tactics used by his government. Beijing is all too happy to prey upon the ignorance of their massive online audience and encourage accusations of racism or xenophobia as the only acceptable response to evidence documenting their own racist, repressive politics. And that right there is how you end up with repressive regimes like the one in China gaining so much power on the global stage, when those who should know better allow their adversaries to cow them into silence. Madam President, I appreciate the importance of diplomacy, but diplomacy is meaningless without consequences. Activists, by their very nature, rise and fall based on their willingness to speak truth to power when the most influential among us allow evil regimes to escape those consequences. Today, I call on my colleagues to follow their example and use their work in this chamber to speak truth to power about the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. We no longer have any excuse not to. If you want proof, pull out your phones and listen to what activists in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in mainland China are telling you, or better yet, listen to what some of your colleagues are telling you. Hong Kong activist Joshua Wong currently sits in jail for the crime of criticizing his government. Madam President, I repeat this. Hong Kong activist, a young freedom fighter, Joshua Wong, is in jail because he criticized the Chinese Communist Party. He criticized his government. His sentencing barely managed a blip on the radar here. Another Hong Kong activist, Jimmy Lai, was denied bail during his own prosecution specifically because his online newspaper revealed the truths of the Chinese Communist Party's chokehold on their own people. The CCP cut off access to his corporate accounts and those of his employees. So much for Hong Kong's free press. Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong live in Hong Kong. In June, the Senate passed a resolution condemning the CCP's repression of speech and expression in Hong Kong. These protests are still happening. Authoritarian crackdowns are still happening. We must keep speaking about this. In Xinjiang, CCP forces are systematically targeting and eliminating the Uyghur Muslim population through mass surveillance, population control, and incarceration in internment camps. Yes, you heard me, internment camps. It should make your skin crawl to hear that today, in 2020, this is happening. Last month, I joined my colleagues, Senator Cornyn and Senator Menendez, in supporting a bipartisan resolution to finally recognize that the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang constitutes a genocide. If you're looking for a reason to start speaking out, I can't think of a better way to get started. Speak up on that. Support this resolution, which would not only urge the White House to take action against Beijing, but also urge national governments and organizations to get their heads out of the sand and tear away, piece by piece, China's disastrous influence over the global political economy, which is highlighted by the success of the Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative. I will add, Madam President, I was thrilled today with Secretary Pompeo's tweet regarding that he is once again re-upping the countries of concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. China is on this list, as well they should be, as they continue to infringe on religious liberty. And they do engage in systematic, ongoing, egregious religious freedom violations. They're doing it every day, and the world is watching. I tell you, I could monopolize this floor for the next week and lay out every opportunity we have to stand up for the cause of freedom and speak truth to power about the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. Here is a white paper that I unveiled earlier this year, and there are over 100 specific paths toward how we as a nation unravel the relationship that we have right now with China. The paper is only 52 pages long. It's a short version, and I would encourage one and all to take a look at it and to think about how it is that we got to this point where an influential government active in many major international bodies, including as of next year, China will be in the UN Human Rights Council. How can this government perpetrate a genocide against minorities and get away with it because of the appalling cowardice of those who bear witness and choose to do nothing? I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Just take out the very top of her answer and pick her up in the middle of her first answer. Yeah, maybe she's probably not. I'm asking her if she can hear us. Probably not. All right, why don't we go back to the Slack? Because yeah, if you take the question and even like the very first of what she did, I think we'll be good. Cool.
Mr. President,
The senator from Wyoming is recognized.
I'd ask that the quorum call be waived,
Without objection.
and I'd ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum also be waived.
Without objection.
I'd ask unanimous consent to start the vote now.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture. By unanimous consent,
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Stephen Sidney Schwartz of Virginia to be a judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims, signed by 17 senators.
thank you. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Stephen Sidney Schwartz of Virginia to be a judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Yes. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Leffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Enzi, Gardner, Grassley, Kennedy, Rubio, Sass, Sullivan. Senators voting in the negative: Cantwell, Kelly, Markey, Menendez, Peters, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall, Van Hollen. White House. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Miss Cinema, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Jones, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Brown, no. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren. No. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen. No. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Graham. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye.
Has any senator not voted? Does any senator wish to change their vote? The yeas are 48, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to. The senator from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. President, thank you. 2 weeks ago, I stood in this same position and gave remarks to my colleagues about the importance of, even though we can't do everything, could we do something? And it seems to be too often that in the way the Senate has operated is that unless we can do everything that everyone wants, we do nothing. And I encouraged us to try to figure out what it is we can agree on and address that legislatively and save the issues that we don't agree on for later. And the challenge that I presented was the circumstance of the consequences of COVID-19, the difficulties that Americans, Kansans are facing, and the importance of us completing our work in regard to an additional response to try to help the economy and to make sure people are healthy and know that they're healthy. We seem to be making progress in regard to that desire to address the needs of Americans. And so while my complaint or concern 2 weeks ago was we don't have to do everything, we can do something, it appears that we're going to do something which is really important. Now I would raise the issue of timing. It's very discouraging me to return to Washington, D.C. to learn that the continuing resolution, which expires on Friday, is to be extended until next Friday at a time in which Americans have little ability to wait, at least to know what they're going to be able to expect. Small businesses, individuals, employees, employers, all need the certainty. And every day that we are unable to accomplish what we can agree on is another day in which those Americans, those workers, those business owners don't know what they face. Christmas ought to be a time, the holiday season ought to be a time for expectations and joy and comfort. And yet what we are doing here by this continued delay is creating uncertainty, which creates great challenges. The mental health and well-being of Kansans and Americans is at stake here. And again, my guess is that whatever we could agree on next week, we could agree on this week. And so I would encourage my colleagues and me to redouble our efforts, not only to do what we can do, but to do it in a timely enough fashion that people get the benefit. I think of those who work in hospitals in Kansas, those who care for people who are suffering from the symptoms of COVID. We need to make certain that we provide them the necessary personal protection equipment, that we need to have the necessary testing, that every hospital, every clinic, every doctor has the resources necessary to care for those who are ill today. That's something that can't wait. And when it comes to the economy, too many businesses, retail establishments, motels, restaurants, venues, theaters, the uncertainty that we're creating that every day goes by in which they don't know whether Congress is going to respond to their needs is a day in which we may lose another business. We may lose another person's employment. And so the request is that we move more quickly than what we have done to date, now that we seem to be zeroing in on a compromise agreement, a bipartisan agreement. That's a piece of good news, but every day that we delay the outcome, the vote, the support the American people, Kansans, need is a day in which more harm is done. It is a time in which uncertainty exists, and while we continue to have our debates and discussions, that uncertainty is creating not only economic problems, but potentially loss of life as well. This place is slow to respond, and I would encourage us to be quicker in our response than what we have been to date. People are struggling, and they need our help. Mr. President, I also would say that too many Kansans have died, people that I know. They've died from COVID. This is a very damaging disease. I would encourage Kansans and Americans to do the personally responsible things and protect themselves, to wear the mask, to socially distance, we do not and cannot afford another shutdown. Every day that goes by in which we're not providing the opportunities for businesses to stay open and employees to be employed, particularly in rural America, the places, Mr. President, that you and I come from, we lose a business to COVID, that business is unlikely to return. If we don't provide the necessary support for our hospitals and healthcare delivery system, there isn't a hospital in Kansas, if it closes its doors today because of COVID, is going to open tomorrow when COVID is behind us. And the deaths that I mentioned in many instances have been the community leaders, the people who have made a difference in communities across Kansas. And every life has value, every life has meaning. We want this death to end. And for purposes of our economy and purposes of life and death, it's time for the United States Senate to act. Not another week delay, not another 2 weeks of unknowing, but let's reach our conclusion. Let's come together and find solutions and provide hope to my constituents in Kansas, yours in Arkansas, and the people of America. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. 1 year ago yesterday, on December 6, 2019, a terrorist attack on the Naval Air Station in Pensacola killed 3 American servicemen. While it is appropriate and it has been done to honor each of these men, I rise today with a solemn purpose of honoring and commemorating the life, service, and patriotism of one in particular, Navy Ensign Joshua Caleb Watson of Enterprise, Alabama, whose promising life and career were tragically cut short in the terrorist attack a year ago yesterday. Caleb was posthumously honored last Friday, receiving the Purple Heart, the ceremony in Pensacola. I really regret that I could not go, that I was unable to join his family. But there was also a wreath-laying ceremony at Building 633, where Caleb was shot, and the candlelight vigil there last night. I know that all were solemn occasions for the Navy, for the family, and for America. Caleb was a rising star. A recent graduate of the Naval Academy, Caleb had dreamed of becoming a Navy pilot and had reported to Pensacola for flight training the week of Veterans Day. Caleb was described as a natural leader, a person who put others first and strived to bring out the best in them. At the Naval Academy, Caleb was a small arms instructor, wrestling coach, and captain of the rifle team. In fact, under his leadership, much to the chagrin of a couple of folks in this body, like Senator Reed, the Academy's rifle team beat Army for the first time in a decade. Ben Watson, Caleb's father, said to me once that Caleb's mission was to confront evil, to bring the fight to them wherever it took him. He was willing to risk his life for his country. And Caleb did confront evil that day, and he made the ultimate sacrifice. Unfortunately, that was not how Caleb intended to serve his country. It was not what Caleb's parents expected when he joined the Navy. Caleb's father put it rather bluntly. We never thought he would die in Florida. Caleb Watson was the officer on deck at the Naval Air Station Pensacola on the morning of December 6, 2019. Consequently, he was one of the first people the shooter encountered. Caleb was shot at least 5 times that day, but heavily wounded. He made his way out to flag down first responders, gave them an accurate description of the shooter that ultimately led to the shooter being killed. Unfortunately, later that day, Caleb died of his wounds while in the hospital. The Navy conducted an investigation into the incident and concluded that the primary cause of the attack was the Saudi shooter's self-radicalization. However, the report also goes on to note numerous deficiencies in many areas, some of which contributed to the attack and others which could have deterred the attack or mitigated the consequences. In other words, things could have been different that day. Things should have been different that day. We lost 2 other young men, Airman Mo Hatham from Florida and Airman Apprentice Cameron Walters of Georgia, and 11 more individuals were wounded. Mr. President, that has happened far too many times. Too many Americans have lost their lives to shooters on U.S. bases, on U.S. soil. The Pensacola attack was the second shooting at a military base in 3 days. On December the 3rd, 2019, a shooting at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard in Hawaii left 2 people dead and a 3rd wounded. There have been several other shootings at U.S. military installations, including a mass shooting in 2009 at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas. That shooting claimed 13 lives and left another 30 injured. 5 years later, another shooting happened at Fort Hood Base when a gunman went on a shooting spree, killing 3 people and injuring 14 before killing himself. 2013, 12 workers at the Washington Navy Yard right here in our nation's capital were killed by a military contractor who was later killed by security officials. And in 2015, 2 military installations in Chattanooga, Tennessee, were attacked by a gunman who killed 4 people before he was shot by police. There have been investigative reports about all of those shootings, and there have been recommendations after each one of those reports, in each one of the reports. And everybody shook their head and said, we've got to do better. This can't be, we can't continue to allow this to happen. But what we see from the Pensacola report that we just received just recently is that many of those recommendations were never followed, especially with regard to planning, training, and assessment of response plans for situations just like the one that occurred in Pensacola, Florida. That is simply inexcusable. Inexcusable. We have young men and women every year, every day, every week, every month that volunteer to put their lives on the line for this country, never dreaming that their life may be put on the line within the security of a confine of a United States military base on U.S. soil, not overseas, not as part of some overseas terrorist attack, but right here where they should be most secure. Ben Watson and his wife, Sheila, have made it their mission to do everything they can to prevent losing more of our sons and daughters in this way. I think this body ought to do the same. Every year we have nominations. We send young men and women. We make nominations and we get the appointments back, sending those young men and women to the academies that will then go to these bases. We have a responsibility for that as well as our overall responsibility to the men and women in the uniform. This year, I asked for, and the conference committee included in the final version of the NDAA, language requiring the Secretary of Defense to implement within 90 days all applicable security and emergency response recommendations to protect our military installations, and language requiring the Secretary of Defense to ensure that each installation conducts and develops a plan to conduct live emergency response training with first responders. At a couple of hearings, including one just last week, I asked Navy leadership at an Armed Services Readiness Subcommittee hearing that took place last week. I asked for their commitment. It's not the first time I'd brought it up, but I knew it was going to be the last hearing, and I knew that this NDAA was hopefully going to include this language. But sometimes the language is just not enough. So I asked for their commitment to ensure that these long overdue steps are taken and accomplished. They, of course, gave me that assurances and that commitment. You know, there are thousands of important provisions in the NDAA that hopefully will come to the floor very soon. But none of those provisions more important than those that ensure that we do everything we can to keep our service members and their families who live and work on our bases safe from attacks like these. As the Navy itself said in the Pensacola report, talking about security manning, and a quote from the report, The Department of the Navy must abandon minimum manning thresholds designed to protect physical assets and to meet ineffective response times. Instead, installations must be manned to rapidly respond with a preponderance of force at any time to preserve our most precious asset, our personnel. Increased security force manning enables presence, deterrence, assurance, and enhanced response. Our most precious asset, our personnel. Well, Mr. President, as a father of 3, a grandfather of 2, I understand how precious our children are to our families. As a member of the Armed Services Committee for the past 2 years, I've seen firsthand how precious our men and women in uniform are to this country. And I've seen this body rise to the occasion to understand our fiduciary responsibilities that we have to those men and women who protect and defend us every day. I had the privilege of visiting with some of the folks in Afghanistan and Iraq and working with many more here in the United States. Wherever they are serving, we owe them our best because we owe them our freedom. I want to thank the Watson family, Ben, Sheila, their son Adam, for their patriotism in supporting Caleb in his dream, become a Navy pilot. And I want to extend again my serious condolences for his untimely death. With the Watsons, however, I want to encourage this body to hold the Navy to the commitments that they made to me last week and to insist that the entire Department of Defense follow its recommendations for protecting our military installations from within. Protect them from future attacks from within. Although I'll be leaving this body in a few weeks, I urge all of my colleagues to take up the baton, to do our congressional oversight duty like our lives depend on it, because our lives depend on it. And if their lives depend on it, our lives depend on it. Everyone should take up that mantle. Everyone should do all that they can to preserve and protect the American servicemen and women that protect us. They are our most precious asset, our personnel. For their sakes and for their families, let's do this thing. Let's get this NDAA passed and then hold them to it in this next Congress. Mr. President, thank you. I yield the floor.
President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the provisions of Rule 22, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the Symington nomination at noon tomorrow. I further ask that post-cloture time with respect to the Swartz and Symington nominations expire at 4 p.m. tomorrow, and the Senate vote on confirmation of the nominations in the order listed. Finally, if any of the nominations are confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President immediately notified the Senate action.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business. The senators permitted to speak therein for 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent. Senate proceed to the consideration of SRES 795 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 795 relating to the death of the Honorable Roger William Jepsen, former United States Senator for the state of Iowa.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 502, H.R. 4761.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 502, H.R. 4761, an act to ensure U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers, agents, and other personnel have adequate synthetic opioid detection equipment and so forth and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar 530, H.R. 5273.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 530, H.R. 5273, an act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to develop a plan to increase to 100% the rates of scanning of commercial and passenger vehicles entering the United States and so forth and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the committee report substitute amendment be agreed to. The bill is amended be considered read a third time and passed. The committee reported amendment to the title be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Committee on Health be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1503, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
Clerk report.
H.R. 1503, an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and so forth and for other purposes.
Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the Alexander substitute amendment at the desk be agreed to. The bill is amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent when the Senate completes its business today at adjournment until 10 a.m. Tuesday, December 8th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Further, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the Symington nomination under the previous order. Finally, I ask that the Senate recess following the cloture vote on the Symington nomination until 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference meetings.
Without objection.
There's no further business to come before the Senate. I ask that it stand adjourned under the provisions of SRES 795 as a further mark of respect for the late Roger William Jepsen, former senator from Iowa.
Under the previous order and pursuant to Senate Res 795, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, December 8th, and does so as a further mark of respect to the late Roger William Jepsen, former senator from Iowa.